I slammed on the brakes, my headlights catching the figure of a child standing in the middle of the empty road. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, his face pale and lifeless under the cold moonlight. Before I could breathe, his shadow stretched unnaturally long, spilling across the asphalt like black ink. It twitched, then jerked upward, towering above the boy, forming limbs, spindly, grotesque limbs that bent in impossible angles. The shadow turned its head, though it had no eyes, and I swear I felt it look at me. I fumbled to shift into reverse, but the boy suddenly raised his hand, palm out, as if to
stop me. His lips curled into a chilling smile. Behind him, the shadow reached forward,
its clawed fingers scraping the ground as it dragged itself closer to my car. My foot pressed hard on the accelerator, but the engine sputtered. The shadow's fingers scraped along my door. Then the boy whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I felt it like cold breath in my ear. And the lights went out. The engine idled behind me as I stepped out of the car, the night pressing in like a heavy blanket. The headlights illuminated the boy standing motionless on the edge of the road. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me, just kept playing with the shadows at his feet, his small hands moving in slow, deliberate gestures. The silence hit me first. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that made my own breathing sound too loud. "Hey, kid!" I called, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" The boy stopped moving, his head tilted slightly, not in response to me, but toward the shadows stretched long and jagged across the asphalt. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me, his face pale and otherworldly in the harsh light. His eyes didn't seem to focus on me, but on something just behind me. "You shouldn't be here when the shadows are awake," he said, his voice soft but layered, like two people speaking at once. I froze, the words twisting in my stomach like ice water.
"What? Where are your
"Parents, are you lost?" He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted back to the shadows. They didn't seem quite right. The way they moved wasn't natural. They pulsed, shifted, like living things, reacting to his movements. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The shadows like to play," he said, his hands moving again in strange patterns. "But they get hungry. They don't like it when people watch." The words hit me like a punch, and I instinctively looked down at the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. One of them, a tall, spindly shape with elongated limbs, twitches violently, its edges sharpening as it seemed to turn toward me. "What the—" I stumbled back, but the boy's head snapped up. For the first time, he smiled, a cold, unnatural expression that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. The shadows moved. They didn't just shift, they crawled. Closer to me, faster. I turned and ran. The boy's smile widened, splitting his face into something that wasn't quite human. My
stomach churned as I froze in place, unable to look away from the way his teeth caught.
The light, sharp and unnatural. Before I could think to speak, he took a step backward.
His movements slow and deliberate, retreating into the darkness.
"Wait," I yelled, taking an instinctive step forward. "Don't." But the words caught in my throat as I saw it. The shadows rippled around him, writhing, like a pool of black liquid disturbed by something massive beneath the surface. His small body seemed to dissolve into the blackness, swallowed whole without a sound. I fumbled for my flashlight, my shaking fingers struggling to grip it. When I finally turned it on, the beam cut through the night but did nothing to pierce the thick, unnatural dark. Where the boy had vanished, the shadows didn't recede. They grew, expanding outward, spilling across the ground in unnatural tendrils that reached toward me. I staggered back, the flashlight trembling in my hands. "This isn't real," I muttered, my voice cracking. "This isn't—" The shadows twitched violently and I heard it, a low, guttural sound like something breathing deeply right behind me. Whipping around, I pointed the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the road stretching endlessly in either direction and the encroaching blackness pressing in from all sides. Panic surged through me and I turned to run. Beam from my flashlight danced. Erratically as I sprinted back to my car, the sound of my pounding footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. I didn't dare look behind me, but in my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of movement, shadowy figures darting through the trees, shapes just out of reach. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, empty and desolate. For a moment, I sat there, panting, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then I saw them. In the rearview mirror, shadows danced along the edges of the light, darting closer and closer, never fully forming, but unmistakably moving, watching, waiting. I jammed the car into gear and hit the gas, but as I sped away, the road seemed longer, darker, as if the night itself was stretching to keep me trapped. The engine cut off, leaving me in silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaking as I fumbled with my keys to unlock the front door. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was still being watched. The porch light flickered as I stepped inside and I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My house was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, all the small, reassuring noises of home felt distant, as if muffled by something unseen. I turned on every light, filling the rooms with harsh, artificial brightness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My skin prickled like a faint static charge in the air. As I moved through the house, my eyes darted to the corners of each room. The shadows there seemed darker than usual, deeper, as if they were waiting for the light to falter. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. "It's just your imagination," I whispered. "You're tired, that's all." But the shadows didn't stay still. I saw it, a flicker in the corner of my vision. Just a twitch, a subtle shift, but it was enough to send me spinning around. The corner was empty, nothing there, yet my heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing in the back of my head. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, needing something normal to ground myself. Midnight. The screen glowed bright in the dim hallway, casting a faint shadow behind me. Then I saw it, my shadow. It didn't match my movements. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't standing still. It leaned forward slightly as if peering over my shoulder. I spun, gasping, but the hallway was empty. The overhead light flickered, buzzing like an angry insect, and I froze. For a moment, the bulb went dark, plunging the room into blackness. I scrambled to turn on the flashlight on my phone. When the light returned, my living room felt different. The shadows were longer now, stretching toward me like reaching hands. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, a child's voice, close. "You brought them with you." I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice was caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. As the lights flickered again and the shadows crept closer, the whisper echoed in my ears long after it stopped, lingering like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes. Every flicker of light, every rustle of the house settling, felt like a warning. By dawn, my fear had twisted into something sharper, desperation. I had to know what was happening. I started with a search for missing children in the area. It felt absurd, but the boy's pale face and eerie smile were burned into my memory, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some random kid. It didn't take long to find something that sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. "Local boy vanishes near Route 17, the headline read. I clicked on the article, my heart pounding. It was dated 30 years ago. The boy's name was Daniel Haynes. 8 years old, last seen playing near the woods at dusk. The details were sparse. Search parties had combed the area for weeks, but found nothing. No body, no clues, just a single witness, an elderly man who claimed to have seen the boy talking to a figure made of shadow right before he disappeared. I sat back in my chair, my mouth dry. It couldn't be the same boy. Daniel would have been long dead or grown, but the grainy black and white photo accompanying the article said otherwise. That was the face I'd seen on the side of the road, the same hollow eyes, the same eerie smile. I kept digging, clicking through forums and archived articles. I found more stories, accounts of strange sightings near the same stretch of road, shadowy figures, whispers in the dark, lights that flickered out without reason. Some people spoke of feeling watched, of being followed by things they couldn't see. Others claimed to have seen the boy too, always near dusk, always silent. My stomach churned as I stumbled across an old forum post from a decade ago. User wrote, "The boy isn't the danger, it's what follows him. Once you see them, they don't let you go." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as a low hum filled my ears. My pulse thundered as a shadow on the wall flickered, shifting slightly when nothing should have moved. The lights above me flickered, and the hum grew louder. They were here. The hum swelled until it felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. I spun in my chair, the screen's glow casting long shadows across the room. But one shadow didn't shift with my movement. It lingered, too tall, too still, standing at the far corner of the room. I grabbed my phone and shone its flashlight at the spot. Nothing, just an empty corner. But when I lowered the light, my heart stopped. The shadow was still there, darker now, its edges sharper. I bolted upright, backing toward the door. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, its light spinning wildly. For a split second, it illuminated the mirror across the room, and I froze. The boy was there. He stood just behind my reflection, staring at me with wide, empty eyes and that same cold, unnatural smile. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. When the flashlight beam shifted again, he was gone. I stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind me, every muscle in my body. Screamed to run, but something told me it wouldn't matter. The shadows were everywhere now, creeping along the edges of the ceiling, coiling in the corners like smoke. By the time I reached my bedroom, I was shaking. I locked the door and crawled under the covers like a terrified child, clutching the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. I pointed it at the ceiling, watching the beam flicker and dance. The shadows moved too. Slowly at first, then faster, slithering like snakes across the walls. A whisper broke the silence. "Elliot." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The light flickered, and for a brief, horrible moment, I saw him again, standing at the foot of my bed, smiling. The light went out. The light didn't come back on. I stayed frozen under the blanket, my breath shallow and ragged, waiting for movement, for sound, anything. But the room was silent. Slowly, peeked out, the darkness pressing in from all sides. My phone lay on the floor, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. For days after that night, I didn't leave the house. I couldn't. Every time I moved to the front door, something stopped me. A faint movement in the corner of my eye, a whisper that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The shadows outside the windows were worse than the ones inside, shifting and crawling like they were alive, I told myself. It was paranoia, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A week passed before I let anyone visit. Sarah, my oldest friend, showed up, unannounced, knocking at the door with a concerned look. "You've been ignoring everyone," she said, stepping into the house. "What's going on?" The words tumbled out in fragments. I told her about the boy, the shadows, the whispers. Her brows furrowed, but she didn't laugh. "There's nothing here, Elliot," she said, walking through the house, flipping lights on and off. I watched her every step, heart pounding. She wasn't looking in the right places, couldn't see the things shifting, just outside the edges of her vision. When she finally left, I walked her to the door, relief and dread swirling in my chest. As she crossed the threshold, I saw it, A shadow stretched behind her, far too large, its form long and jagged. It followed her down the path, creeping closer as she walked. Away. 2 days later, Sarah called, her voice trembling. They're everywhere, Elliot. Line cut off. The shadows in my house laughed. I hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent my heart racing. The shadows felt alive, watching, waiting for me to slip. I'd taken to keeping the TV on, its dull glow casting just enough light to stave off the worst of them. Or so I thought. It happened while I sat curled on the couch, half watching some mindless late-night show, the volume low enough that the hum of static crept into the silence. At first, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the screen, a flicker behind me. My stomach tightened, but I didn't turn. I couldn't. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing down on me like a weight. And then I heard it. Elliot. It wasn't a whisper this time. The voice was clear, soft but sharp, cutting through the noise like glass. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room. The boy was there. He stood perfectly still, his pale face half obscured by shadows that writhed around him. Like living things, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking, and his lips parted into that same unnatural smile I'd seen before. You saw them, he said, his voice layered as if two people were speaking at once. They saw you. Now they want you. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my words caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The boy tilted his head as if studying me, his expression eerily calm. They're hungry, he continued. Once they notice you, they never stop. Not until there's nothing left. My skin prickled as the shadows around him pulsed, spreading outward in dark tendrils. How do I stop them? I finally managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. The boy's smile faded. You go back, he said, to the road. That's where the source is. The light flickered, and in the blink of an eye, the boy was gone. The shadows receded, melting into the corners of the room. But his words stayed, echoing in my head like a tolling bell. I had to go back, and I wasn't sure I would survive. The road looked different at night. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam cutting through the heavy darkness. Each step felt like a countdown to something inevitable. As I approached the spot where I'd first seen the boy, the air grew colder. My breath puffed in short clouds, the only sound in the crushing silence. Then, just like before, I saw him. He stood at the edge of the woods, his pale face glowing faintly in the light. His hands moved in slow, deliberate gestures, tracing shapes in the air. The shadows around him pulsed, alive with motion. He looked up as I approached, his unblinking eyes locking onto mine. You came back? He said, his voice carrying the same strange, layered tone. You said I had to, I replied, my voice shaking. Where is it? The source? The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the trees, where the darkness was thickest. The flashlight barely penetrated the shadows, which seemed to shift and writhe as if resisting the light. It's in there, the boy said, his tone flat, almost bored. But they won't let you leave if you go. The words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't turn back now. I stepped into the woods, the flashlight flickering as the shadows thickened around me. Harder, the air heavier, like walking through water. The shadows weren't just watching anymore. They reached out, clawing at me, their icy touch brushing my arms and legs. Whispering voices swirled in the dark, calling my name, laughing, crying. My heart pounded as images flickered in the corner of my vision, faces I knew, twisted with pain and glimpses of myself screaming silently. The whispers grew louder, unbearable until I saw it. A faint, pulsing glow deeper in the woods. The source. The glow pulsed faintly, a sickly, rhythmic light that seemed alive. It drew me deeper into it. The forest, the whispers around me growing louder with each step. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. I tightened my grip, my fingers trembling. Then I saw it. The cabin stood crooked and decayed, barely visible beneath twisting vines and encroaching shadows. The glow seeped from the cracks in its walls, throbbing like a heartbeat. As I approached, the air grew colder, the shadows denser, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. The whispers twisted into mocking laughter. The boy appeared in front of the door. He wasn't smiling anymore, his eyes empty and sad met mine. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You told me to come," I said, my voice cracking. "You said I could stop it." The boy shook his head. "No one stops them. You either join them or they want. The words hit me like a blow. I stepped back, but the shadows surged forward, cutting off my retreat. Their tendrils lashed out, brushing my arms and legs with icy fingers. The boy pointed toward the cabin. "It's in there," he said softly, "the source. But it's watching. You. It knows you're here." The door creaked open before I could respond. The shadows inside writhed like living creatures, their shapes flickering between human forms and something monstrous. At the center of the room was the glow, a mass of darkness and light, shifting and pulsating, pulling the shadows toward it like a black hole. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the boy's voice echoed behind me. "You can't destroy it, but you can feed it. It's the only way to survive." The door slammed shut, and I was alone with the source. The air inside the cabin was suffocating. Every breath felt thick, heavy with the scent of damp rot and something metallic, something alive. The glowing mass pulsed, rhythmically drawing the shadows toward it like moths to a flame. They twisted and writhed, whispering words I couldn't understand but could feel deep in my bones. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam scattering weak light across the room. The source reacted, its pulse quickening, and the shadows screamed, high-pitched, inhuman cries that rattled my teeth. My heart pounded as I pointed the flashlight at the glowing mass, the light quivering over its shifting surface. The mass recoiled, its glow dimming as the shadows around it thrashed wildly. It was working. I stepped closer, forcing the beam directly onto the center of the mass. The shadows shrieked louder, their forms collapsing into jagged, chaotic shapes. The cabin wall groaned, the entire structure trembling as the source began to shrink. Hope surged through me. But then the light went out. Darkness swallowed the room, complete and consuming. I scrambled to turn the flashlight back on, but icy tendrils coiled around my wrist, yanking me toward them. Source. My scream was choked as the shadows dragged me closer, their touch freezing and burning at once. I kicked and clawed. They were stronger, their whispers now a deafening roar. Just as the glowing mass began to envelop me, the boy appeared. His small figure stood between me and the source, his face somber. "You need to leave," he said, his voice filled with a strange sadness. Before I could reply, he stepped forward into the light and darkness combined. The shadows recoiled, screeching as the boy's form merged with the mass. The room shook violently, the walls collapsing inward. I was thrown back, landing hard on the forest floor as the cabin imploded in a burst of shadow and silence. When I looked up, the cabin was gone, the woods eerily still, but the shadows weren't. They lingered at the edges, waiting, watching. The days after the cabin felt surreal. I convinced myself it was over. The shadows had receded, the whispers silenced. I turned home bruised but alive, clutching onto a fragile hope that whatever happened in those woods had ended with the boy's sacrifice. But deep down, I knew better. At first, the changes were subtle. Shadows felt longer, darker, but I told myself it was just paranoia. The house creaked more often, the air seemed colder, but I ignored it. Each time I passed a mirror, I forced myself not to look too closely, afraid of what I might see. Then one night, I saw him. It wasn't much, just a fleeting glimpse in the bathroom mirror, the boy's face pale and silent, staring at me from the corner of the reflection. By the time I turned around, he was gone. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just exhaustion. But the laughter didn't last. The shadows returned. I noticed them first in the corners of my vision, flickering and darting when I turned my head. At night, they pressed closer, creeping along the walls as I lay in bed, their forms shifting and twisting like they were alive. Sometimes I heard faint whispers, the boy's voice blending with others. "You can't escape," they said. Tonight, as I write this, the air feels heavier than ever. The lights in the house flicker and the whispers are louder. I haven't turned around in hours, afraid of what I might see, but I can feel them. They're watching me, just out of sight, waiting. And as I finish this, the lights go out. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings them closer. Are you alone as you finish this, or something watching from the shadows? The figure stood at the edge of the woods, its back turned, its head tilted, as if listening. To something deep within, a single step forward shattered the silence, and it turned, revealing a face stretched into an impossible grin. Somewhere behind, from the trees, laughter echoed, low, distorted, and getting closer. The truck's tires hummed against the asphalt as the road stretched endlessly ahead. The figure from before still lingered in Jack's mind, an image he couldn't shake. He tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes scanning the dark. And then there it was again, standing by the shoulder of the road, barely illuminated by his headlights, was the same man, or so it seemed. This time, he wasn't alone. More figures stood beside him, similarly dressed in old tattered clothes. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge the truck. They just stood there, their heads slightly tilted, staring into the dark woods as if listening for something. Jack's chest tightened, an unnatural chill crawling down his spine. He pressed harder on the gas, speeding past them. His hands trembled on the wheel as he glanced in the rear-view mirror, expecting to see their silhouettes disappearing into the distance. But the mirror showed nothing. They were gone. Ahead, the road seemed narrower now, the trees on either side growing taller and more twisted. Their gnarled branches reached overhead, creating a canopy that seemed to close Jack in. The air inside the truck felt heavier, pressing down on him, as if the very atmosphere had changed. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went out completely for a brief, terrifying moment. Darkness swallowed the truck. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he slapped the dashboard in panic. When the lights returned, the road was empty. No figures, no sign of life. Jack exhaled shakily and glanced at the GPS for reassurance, but the screen was blank, filled with nothing but static. As the truck rolled forward, a thought crept into his mind, unbidden and chilling. They were never meant to be seen. The dim glow of a flickering streetlight pierced the endless dark ahead. Underneath it stood a figure, their outline just barely visible against the shadowy backdrop. Jack's stomach tightened as his truck drew closer, the figure slowly coming into view. It was a person, standing unnervingly still, their face tilted downward as though studying the cracked pavement beneath them. Jack's pulse quickened. The road was desolate. No cars, no signs of life for miles. Against every ounce of reason, his foot eased off the gas. As the truck slowed, the figure's head lifted, revealing a face stretched into a grotesque, toothy grin that reached unnaturally wide. The hitchhiker didn't move, just stared, their hollow eyes glinting faintly under the erratic light. Jack's hand shot to the door lock. The sharp click of the mechanism broke the eerie silence inside the cab. He floored the gas, swerving slightly to avoid the figure. The hitchhiker's mouth moved, forming words Jack couldn't hear over the roar of his engine. As the truck sped past, Jack's heart thundered in his chest. For a moment, relief washed over him until his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was gone. No trace of them under the sputtering streetlight. Jack's breath hitched, and then he heard it, a faint tap from the back of the truck. The sound came again, louder this time, a steady, deliberate knocking that sent chills racing down his spine. His hands tightened on the wheel as he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself it was nothing. The knocking turned into pounding, each thud reverberating through the truck like a heartbeat. Jack's resolve broke. He pulled over, his trembling hands fumbling to grab the flashlight from the glove compartment. With the beam shaking in his grip, Jack circled to the truck bed, forcing himself to look. The space was empty, but the knocking didn't stop. It came again, this time from inside. The cab, right behind him. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same cracked asphalt disappearing into a horizon that never seemed to come closer. Jack squinted at the surrounding forest, trying to make sense of the dark shapes beyond the tree line. Were they shifting, or was his mind playing tricks on him? He hadn't seen another car for hours. The absence of taillights, headlights, or even the faintest hum of an engine felt suffocating. Just as Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, a strange mist began to roll in. It rose from the ground like a creeping tide, swallowing the base of the trees, then inching onto the road. Soon, it was everywhere, wrapping around the truck like cold, damp fingers. The radio crackled to life. The static was sharp and grating, making Jack flinch. "Come on," he muttered, reaching for the dial to turn it off. But before he could, the static changed. Beneath the noise was something else, a low, distorted voice whispering, "Jack, Jack." Jack froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. His name came again, dragged out like a warning, followed by a faint, high-pitched laugh that didn't belong to anything human. He grabbed the radio, yanking it free from the dash, and threw it onto the passenger seat. The laughter faded, but the silence that replaced it felt even worse. The mist thickened, clinging to the truck's windows. Jack leaned forward, squinting to see through the haze. Then he spotted movement, faint silhouettes darting between the trees, their forms just out of focus. They were too quick, too fluid, like shadows made flesh. Every time he thought he'd locked onto one, it vanished, only to reappear. Closer, closer. One shape broke away, stepping onto the road ahead. Jack slammed on the brakes, but when the truck stopped, the road was empty. Something tapped on the driver's side window. Jack pulled the truck to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he killed the engine. The oppressive mist had thinned just enough for him to see a few feet ahead. Exhaled, shakily, trying to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. The silence outside was suffocating. Even the usual chirp of insects or rustle of leaves had vanished, leaving only the sound of his breathing. Jack stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching against the cracked asphalt. That's when he saw it. Etched into the road directly in front of the truck was a strange symbol, a circle, surrounded by jagged, angular lines, like a warped sun. The edges of the carving seemed too sharp, too precise to have been worn into the pavement naturally. Jack knelt, running a hand over the grooves. They were deep, freshly cut. The realization sent a chill through him. The mist swirled faintly around his ankles as he straightened, his eyes catching a shape. Off to the side of the road, a weathered wooden signpost leaned crookedly, its paint peeling in words barely legible. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Black Hollow. The name tugged at something in his memory, though he couldn't place it. A shiver ran down his spine as he stepped closer to the sign, the mist pulling back just enough for him to see the dark woods beyond. Then he heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. Jack spun. Around, heart pounding, no one was there, but his shadow cast faintly by the truck's headlights was wrong. It stretched unnaturally long across the ground, its edges jagged, twisting as though it had a mind of its own. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft, low whisper. "Jack, Jack. Jack's breath caught when he saw the faint glow of a gas station sign cutting through. The mist, relief surged as he pulled into the cracked, weed-choked lot. The building leaned slightly, its paint peeling and windows smeared with grime, a single light above. The door flickered erratically, buzzing like a dying insect, but any sign of life was better than the endless, empty road. He stepped out, his boots crunching on broken glass. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. Dust coated the shelves, and the racks were nearly empty, stocked only with long-expired snacks and dented cans. At the far end of the room, an old map hung on the wall. Jack approached it, wiping off a layer of grime to get a better look. The surrounding towns were marked clearly, but Black Hollow was nowhere to be found. His stomach sank. The lights flickered again, casting the room into brief darkness. When they came back, something caught Jack's eye, a movement in the reflection of the station's large front window. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, but the lot outside was empty. Then he saw it in the glass, a tall figure standing by the truck, wearing a wide-brimmed It didn't move, its form almost blending into the mist. Jack spun toward the lot, but there was no one there. A loud slam startled him, and he whipped back around. The station door had shut on its own, the lock clicking into place. At the same moment, the radio in his truck blared to life. Outside, a burst of static that made his ears ring. Then came the whispering, faint at first, then louder, filling the space around him. "You shouldn't have come." Jack's breath came fast and shallow as he threw himself against the gas station's back door. The heavy wood resisted for a moment before splintering open, and he stumbled out into the suffocating mist. His truck was still there, the headlights glowing faintly through the haze, but the radio inside was screeching like a wailing animal. The sound grew louder as Jack ran to the driver's side, his hands fumbling to yank them. Door open. Sliding into the seat, he slammed it shut and twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he shifted into drive, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the gas station. As the truck sped down the road, the radio cut out abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. Then, slowly, a voice emerged from the static. At first, it was garbled, incomprehensible. But as Jack turned the volume knob with shaking fingers, the words became clear. Turn back. You're not supposed to be here." The voice sent ice down his spine. It was calm but distorted, like it was speaking from a place just outside reality. Jack's knuckles whitened on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The voice dissolved into soft, mocking laughter that grew louder, filling them cab until he couldn't take it anymore. "Shut up!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then his headlights cut through the mist and illuminated a figure hanging from a tree in the middle of the road. The body swayed unnaturally, the neck bent at a grotesque angle. Jack's foot hit the brakes, but the figure opened its eyes, their hollow blackness staring straight at him, its head twisted toward him, though the noose held its neck rigid. Jack swerved violently, the truck spinning off the road and into a shallow ditch with a sickening jolt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving Jack trapped in darkness. Jack stumbled out of the truck, his legs shaky and his head pounding from the crash. The cool night air felt oppressive, thicker than before, as if the forest itself was alive and pressing in. The mist coiled low around his ankles, and the distant hum of chanting caught his ears. It was faint, rhythmic, and unrelenting, like a heartbeat pounding. Somewhere deep within the woods. The trees ahead seemed wrong, their trunks twisted unnaturally, their branches bending as though reaching for something unseen. Jack hesitated, fear bubbling in his chest, but the chanting tugged at him, pulling him forward. With each step, the sound grew louder, weaving around him like a hypnotic song. He felt his breathing quicken, each inhale sharper, as if the air itself resisted entering his lungs. The forest grew darker as he walked, the moonlight unable to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. Shadows slithered across the ground, moving too fluidly to be cast by anything natural. Jack tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the chanting, which now seemed to come from all directions. It wasn't English or any language he recognized, but the tone carried a sense of malice, of something ancient and wrong. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the trees parted just for him. In the center stood an altar carved from black stone, its surface etched with the same jagged sun symbol Jack had seen on the road. Surrounding it were figures, their bodies draped in dark cloaks, their faces obscured beneath wide-brimmed hats. Heads bowed, the chanting emanating from them in perfect unison. Jack's stomach twisted as the figures lifted their heads in unison, revealing faces devoid of eyes. Hollow sockets stared straight at him, and the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at Jack. The shadows around the clearing surged toward him. Jack pressed himself against the rough bark of the tree, his heart hammering so loudly. He swore it would give him away. The figures in the clearing stood motionless now, their eyeless faces turned toward the altar. The black stone glowed faintly, its jagged sun symbol pulsating with an eerie, rhythmic light that matched the beat of Jack's pounding pulse, pulse. The chanting grew louder, their voices blending into a low, guttural hum. Jack's breath caught as a sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, snuffing out the torches in an instant. Darkness enveloped the space, broken only by the faint, pulsating glow of the altar. Shadows sprang to life, twisting and stretching, reaching out like living things. Jack took a slow step back, his foot snapping a dry branch. Unnaturally through the clearing, slicing through the silence like a gunshot, the chanting stopped. The figures turned in perfect unison, their hollow sockets fixed directly on him. Their pale, waxy faces twisted, mouths opening wide, though no sound came. Shadows surged toward him, snaking through the grass and up the trees, enclosing him in an inky darkness that felt alive. Jack staggered backward, his breath quick and shallow, the shadows wrapped around, his legs cold and suffocating, pulling him forward despite his frantic struggle. He grabbed at the tree, his fingers digging into the bark, but it was useless. The shadows dragged him into the clearing, depositing him at the base of the altar. The figures loomed over him now, their heads tilting unnaturally as if studying him. One stepped closer, its eyeless gaze piercing through him. It raised a pale hand and placed it on Jack's forehead. A searing pain shot through his skull as the figure whispered a single word, chosen. The altar's glow intensified, and the world around him began to fade into black. The searing pain in Jack's head subsided just enough for him to act. With a burst of adrenaline, he shoved the figure's hand away, scrambling to his feet. The shadows writhed in response, slithering closer as the eyeless figures began to chant again, their guttural voices rising in unison. Jack ran. The forest was alive around him, the air thick with the sounds of whispering voices and the crackling of unseen movement. Shadows darted between the trees, stretching and twisting unnaturally, faster than anything human. They followed him, closing in like a swarm of serpents, brushing against his legs and arms with icy tendrils that stung like frostbite. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he pushed through the dense underbrush, his lungs burning with each panicked breath. The chanting didn't fade, it seemed to follow, him growing louder as if it were coming from within his own mind. He risked a glance behind him and immediately wished he hadn't. The shadows were moving faster now, their forms indistinct but unmistakably predatory, and they were gaining ground. Jack stumbled, his foot catching on an exposed root. He hit the ground hard, the impact rattling through his chest. The shadows surged toward him, but just as he thought they would consume him, he saw it, a glowing symbol carved into the forest floor. It was faint, pulsating with the same jagged sun pattern from the road and the altar. With no other option, Jack lunged toward it, crawling the last few feet as his hand touched the symbol. A blinding light erupted, and the shadows recoiled with a piercing, otherworldly shriek. Jack's vision blurred, his body feeling as though it were being pulled through a collapsing tunnel. When the light faded, he was back on the road, but it wasn't the same. The trees stood unnaturally still, and the road stretched endlessly ahead. He wasn't alone. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. The road stretched before him in endless darkness, flanked by tall, motionless trees.
He
Pressed the gas harder, desperate to put miles between himself and the forest, the altar, the shadows. Minutes passed, then an hour, but something was wrong. The road felt too familiar. He slowed the truck, scanning the trees for a landmark, anything to prove he wasn't just driving in circles. His breath caught as a battered road sign came into view. The faded letters spelled out, "Welcome to Black Hollow." "No," Jack whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." His foot slammed on the gas, the truck roaring forward. He kept his eye on the road, refusing to look at the woods on either side. But the further he drove, the more the same landmarks repeated, twisted. Trees, a rusted streetlight, the same sign. The truck's GPS flickered to life, its screen illuminating the cab with cold, bluish light. Jack glanced at it, hoping for an escape route, but his stomach dropped. The screen displayed only 2 words, Black Hollow. The truck hit a bump, and the GPS screen fizzled with static before going dark. A burst of static filled the cab, making Jack flinch. The radio crackled faint at first, then louder. The laughter returned, distorted and mocking, echoing around him. The radio, but the sound wouldn't stop. The laughter dissolved into a voice, deep, cold, and hollow. "You'll never leave." Jack's chest tightened as the headlights flickered. For a moment, everything was black. When the lights returned, a figure stood in the middle of the road. It was tall, its face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Jack swerved, the truck spinning wildly. When it stopped, the figure was standing at his window, smiling. Jack's chest heaved as he stared at the figure outside his window. Its face was hidden under the shadow of the wide-brimmed hat, but the grin stretched far too wide, sharp, and unnatural. Jack tried to move, to hit the gas, but his body wouldn't respond. The truck's engine sputtered, the lights dimming to a weak glow. The figure tilted its head, and Jack's own reflection flickered in the rearview mirror, but it wasn't him. The face in the glass was pale, sunken, with hollow eyes and that same impossible grin. The reflection mouthed a single word, "Run." The truck's interior plunged into complete darkness as the engine died. Jack's breath hitched, and the mist outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows. He fumbled for his phone, its faint glow barely illuminating his trembling hands. As he glanced up, the figure was gone. The passenger door creaked open. Jack's head snapped to the side, his pulse hammering in his ears. The seat next to him was empty, but the air felt cold, heavy, as though something unseen had just entered. Faint whisper brushed his ear, soft and teasing. "You can't leave." The shadows inside the cab began to shift, stretching along the floor and climbing the walls like ink spreading across a page. Jack tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as the figure appeared again, this time in the driver's seat. It was him. Every detail was exact, except for the lifeless eyes and that horrifying smile. "You shouldn't have stopped," the doppelganger said, its voice low and hollow. The truck lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging everything into darkness. Jack's last thought wasn't of escape, but of the realization that this wasn't the end. It never would be. The next time you're on an empty road and see something, or someone, unexpected, remember, some roads don't lead anywhere, and some stops can't be undone. Are you sure you're safe where you are, or is something already waiting in the dark?